Dakota Territory, autumn of 1883. Elara Vance was digging. Not a well, not a root cellar, but a wide, shallow pit where her family's home was supposed to stand. She worked with a quiet intensity, her shovel slicing into the prairie sod, ignoring the puzzled stares of her neighbors. They were building with logs, with sweat and saws, raising stout walls against the sky. Elara was going down, into the earth. Her husband, Samuel, helped, his face a mask of determined loyalty, but the rest of the small settlement saw only madness. They watched her mix clay, sand, and straw with water, stomping it with her bare feet into a thick, heavy mud. This was not the work of a home builder. It was the nonsensical play of a child, writ large and foolish on the open prairie. The structure that slowly rose from the pit was thick, curved, and windowless on the north side. It looked less like a house and more like a termite mound, a strange earthen lump on the vast, flat land. The community gave it a name, a casual cruelty whispered first at the trading post and then spoken openly. They called it Vance's Mud Pie. They laughed, but in a few short months, a winter storm of historic fury would descend upon them, a polar vortex that would shatter records and break the wills of the strongest men. When that storm was over, 9 families would owe their lives to the woman they mocked and to the strange earthen shelter they had dismissed as a fool's dream. What did this quiet woman, a newcomer from the arid South, understand about heat, cold, and survival that generations of hardened prairie settlers had missed? What secret was held within the thick clay walls of her ridiculous mud house? Before we uncover the simple, radical physics behind her design, hit that subscribe button right now for more stories of forgotten frontier genius. And drop a comment below telling us where you are watching from in the world. We want to know how far these incredible histories are traveling. To understand Elara's solution, one must first understand the brutal nature of the problem. A Dakota winter was not merely cold, it was an active, malevolent force. It arrived in October and did not release its grip until April. It was a season of relentless wind that scoured the landscape, a wind so sharp it could drive ice crystals through the smallest cracks in a cabin wall. Temperatures would plummet to 20, 30, even 40 degrees below zero and stay there for weeks. At these temperatures, metal became brittle and snapped. Trees exploded as their sap froze. A man could lose fingers to frostbite in the time it took to walk from his cabin to his barn. Survival was not a given. It was a daily, desperate fight. The settlers fought back with the only tools they knew: wood and fire. They built their cabins from thick logs, felling the scarce cottonwoods that grew along the creek beds. They believed in the power of timber. A thick log wall, they reasoned, was a strong barrier against the cold. They chinked the gaps between the logs with a mixture of mud and moss, a painstaking process that was never truly finished. The wind always found a way in. Inside these cabins, life was a constant battle for warmth. The cast iron stove was the heart of the home, but it was a hungry, inefficient heart. It devoured firewood at an astonishing rate. A family might spend their entire autumn cutting and stacking a massive woodpile, only to see it shrink with terrifying speed during a cold snap. The stove created a small bubble of heat in the center of the room, but the edges remained frigid. Water barrels froze solid even indoors. A rime of frost would creep across the blankets of sleeping children. Ink froze in its wells, and potatoes stored in a corner bin would turn to icy stones. The settlers were living inside wooden boxes that leaked heat almost as fast as their fires could produce it. Their walls, for all their thickness, were poor insulators. The cold leached through the timber, a constant, draining presence. This was the conventional wisdom. the accepted method of survival passed down from one generation of frontiersmen to the next. It was a method that worked, but only just. It demanded constant labor, consumed enormous resources, and offered a miserable, marginal existence through the winter months. It was a system perpetually on the edge of failure. Alara Vance had seen a different way. She was not from the cold, wooded East. She had grown up in the New Mexico Territory, a land of blistering sun and surprisingly cold nights. There, people did not build with logs to fight the elements. They built with the earth itself. They built with adobe. She understood a principle of physics that the Dakota settlers, with their focus on wood, had completely overlooked. It was the principle of thermal mass. The log cabins were designed around the idea of insulation, resisting the transfer of heat. A thick wall was meant to be a barrier, but wood, while a better insulator than stone, is not a perfect one. In the face of a relentless 40 below zero wind, the heat inside a log cabin simply bled out through the walls, the roof, and the countless tiny gaps. The fire had to run constantly just to keep the indoor temperature from plummeting. Alara's design was based on a different concept: storing heat. Her thick earthen walls were not meant to be a simple barrier. They were meant to be a battery, a thermal battery. Clay and earth possess immense thermal mass, meaning they can absorb and hold a tremendous amount of heat energy. Her plan was to build a structure that would soak up the heat from her small, efficient stove during the day. The walls themselves would become a source of warmth. Then, at night, as the fire died down to embers, those same walls would slowly, gently radiate their stored heat back into the living space, keeping the temperature stable and comfortable until morning. It was a simple, elegant idea, born from centuries of desert wisdom. But on the Dakota prairie, it looked like sheer insanity. The construction began in late summer. Samuel dug the foundation, a rectangular pit 4 feet deep. This subterranean element was the first part of the system. By sinking the floor below the frost line, Alara was already using the Earth's stable temperature to her advantage. The ground itself would insulate the lower half of her home from the brutal surface cold. Then came the walls. This was the part that drew the most scorn. Alara, Samuel, and their 2 young children spent weeks mixing the cob, a simple recipe of clay-rich soil, sand, water, and straw. The straw acted as a natural rebar, giving the dried clay tensile strength and preventing it from cracking. They mixed it in shallow pits, using their own weight to work the materials together into a stiff, uniform consistency. They did not use forms or bricks. They simply lifted heavy handfuls of the wet cob and pressed them onto the low foundation walls, building up the structure layer by layer. They sculpted the walls with their hands, smoothing the surfaces, rounding the corners. The walls rose slowly, a few inches each day, needing time to dry in the sun before the next layer could be added. They were incredibly thick, nearly 2 feet at the base, tapering to about 18 inches at the top. Thomas Cole was the first to voice his objections. Cole was the region's most respected builder, a master carpenter from Ohio who had constructed nearly half the cabins in the settlement. He was a practical, no-nonsense man whose work was known for its tight joints and sturdy roofs. He approached Alara one afternoon, his arms crossed, a look of genuine concern on his face. He pointed a calloused finger at the rising earthen wall. "Ma'am," he began, his voice respectful but firm, "that wall is going to kill you. Earth is cold. It draws the heat right out of a body, and it holds the damp. Come the first big melt, you'll have water seeping right through. It'll be a tomb in winter and a swamp in spring." Alara wiped a smear of mud from her forehead and looked at him. Her reply was simple, without a hint of defensiveness. "The earth will hold my fire's heat, Mr. Cole. It will keep us warm when the stove is low." Cole shook his head, a small, sad smile on his lips. That's not how it works. You need an air gap. You need seasoned timber. The heat will go straight into that mud and disappear. You're building a refrigerator to live in. He was not being cruel. He was trying to save her from a fatal mistake, based on everything his experience had taught him. He was trying to help. The mockery from the rest of the community was less well-intentioned. As the structure took shape, it became a local landmark of foolishness. Men would ride out of their way on the trip back from the trading post just to have a look and a laugh. "See if the gopher's home," they'd shout to Samuel, who would simply nod and continue his work. The women were more direct in their criticism, cornering Alara near the communal well. "Alara, dear," one said, placing a hand on her arm, "there is still time to build with proper logs. Thomas Cole says he would help. Think of your children. You cannot raise them in a dirt hole." Alara's response was always the same. "I am thinking of my children. This will keep them safe." The roof was the final piece of the puzzle. Samuel, using his limited carpentry skills, laid thick log rafters over the top of the earthen walls. But instead of thin planks, they covered the rafters with a dense layer of willow branches, followed by a thick thatch of prairie grass. On top of this, they carefully laid sod, cut directly from the prairie. The roof, like the walls, was a living part of the earth. It would provide incredible insulation, and in the summer, the grass would grow, helping to keep the interior cool. The system was now complete. It was a lung, breathing with the earth. The lower half was protected by the stable temperature of the subsoil. The thick, high-mass walls were a battery for storing heat. The living roof was a heavy blanket of insulation. A single, small, south-facing window allowed the low winter sun to penetrate deep into the space, its energy absorbed and stored by the dark earthen floor. The north wall, which faced the relentless winter wind, was a solid, windowless mass of clay 2 feet thick. The final structure was not beautiful. It was a low, rounded hump on the prairie, barely rising above the tall grasses. The door was its only conventional feature. To the settlers, it confirmed their worst assumptions. It was primitive. It was a step backward. They had come to the frontier to build a new world, to raise civilization from the plains with axe and saw. Alara Vance had simply crawled back into the dirt. As the first cold winds of November began to blow, the laughter died down, replaced by a kind of grim pity. The Vances were seen as a lost cause, a family doomed by the strange ideas of a stubborn woman. The community prepared for winter, stacking their woodpiles high, chinking their walls one last time and saying a quiet prayer for the poor souls in Vance's mud pie. Then December came. It arrived not with a gentle dusting of snow, but with a roar. A weather system, the likes of which no one had ever seen, descended from the Arctic. The old trappers called it a Siberian Express. It was a wave of unimaginable cold that rolled across the plains like a physical entity. The temperature at dawn on December 12th was 10 degrees Fahrenheit, cold but manageable. By sunset, it was 12 below zero. The wind picked up, a steady, shrieking gale from the northwest that drove the snow horizontally. By the next morning, the thermometer read -25, and it kept dropping. For the settlers in their log cabins, the world shrank to the small circle of warmth around their stoves. The fight was on. Every waking moment was consumed with feeding the fire. The woodpiles, which had looked so immense just days before, were now dwindling at a terrifying pace. The wind tore at their homes, forcing its way through every crack and crevice, a constant whining reminder of the lethal cold outside. Inside, the misery was acute. Despite the roaring fires, the cabin walls were coated with a thick layer of frost. Water left more than a few feet from the stove turned to ice. Families huddled together under every blanket they owned, their breath crystallizing in the air. The cabins were failing. The conventional wisdom was being systematically dismantled by the sheer physics of extreme cold. Thomas Cole was suffering as much as anyone. His own cabin, the pinnacle of his craft, felt like a sieve. He and his wife stuffed rags into the gaps around the window frames, but the wind still cut through. He was burning through his seasoned oak at a rate that filled him with a cold dread. In just 2 days, he had used what should have been 2 weeks' worth of fuel. His children were sick, their coughs echoing in the frigid air. His wife's face was etched with fear. He, the master builder, the man everyone trusted to know how to build a proper home, was failing his own family. The cold was winning. And as he sat by his stove, feeding log after log into its hungry mouth, his thoughts turned to Alara Vance. He imagined the scene inside her earthen hovel, the damp, the creeping chill he had predicted. He pictured the family huddled together, their fire long since extinguished, freezing in the dark. A profound sense of guilt washed over him. He had mocked her. He had stood by and let her build a death trap for her family. What if they were already gone? The thought was unbearable. He had to know. He had to try to help, if it wasn't already too late. He pulled on his heaviest coat, wrapped his face in wool, and told his wife he was going to check on the Vances. She begged him not to go. The short walk was a death sentence, but his guilt was a stronger force than the wind. He stepped out into the storm. The journey was a nightmare. The distance was less than 200 yards, but it felt like miles. The wind was a solid wall, stealing his breath and driving ice crystals into his eyes. The air was so cold it hurt to inhale, a sharp, searing pain deep in his lungs. He navigated by memory, his head down, pushing through snow that was already waist-deep in the drifts. He finally saw it, a low mound nearly buried in the snow. A thin tendril of smoke rose from the small chimney pipe, but it was whipped away instantly by the gale. There was no light from the single window. His heart sank. He had been right. They were freezing in there. He stumbled to the door, his gloved hands fumbling with the latch, and pushed it open, preparing himself for the grim scene inside. The first thing that hit him was the warmth. It was not the scorching, dry heat of an overstoked stove. It was a gentle, radiant warmth, as profound and encompassing as summer sunshine. It washed over his frozen face and hands, a physical wave of comfort that was so unexpected it made him stagger. He stood blinking in the doorway, his mind struggling to process what his senses were telling him. The air inside smelled of baking bread and dried herbs. The light was soft, coming from a single lantern, and the scene before him was one of impossible, shocking domestic peace. Samuel Vance sat at a small table, mending a piece of tack. He wore a simple wool shirt, his sleeves rolled up to his forearms. On the floor, on a braided rag rug, sat his 2 children. They were playing with carved wooden toys. They were barefoot. Alara Vance stood near a small, efficient-looking stove, a dusting of flour on her apron. She was sliding a loaf of bread from a small oven box set on top of it. Steam rose from the golden-brown crust. There was no frost on the walls. There was no desperate huddling. There was only a calm, quiet, and deeply warm sanctuary, utterly disconnected from the howling apocalypse just outside the door. Cole felt a sudden urge to subscribe to a new way of thinking, a feeling that if this story of survival could reach others, it might save them too. He knew in that moment he had to share what he was seeing, to ensure this knowledge wasn't lost. He closed the door, shutting out the storm. The silence was as shocking as the warmth. The roar of the wind was gone, replaced by a deep, profound quiet. Alara turned to him, her expression calm, unsurprised. "Mr. Cole," she said softly, "you look frozen. Come in." He took a few hesitant steps into the room, his eyes scanning every detail. He was an expert builder, and his mind began to work, to analyze, to understand the miracle he was witnessing. He looked at the stove. It was a small, simple model, and the fire within it was banked low, a bed of glowing embers rather than a roaring blaze. This was impossible. A fire that small should have provided no meaningful heat against this cold. He walked to the north wall, the one he had been so certain would be a sheet of ice. He reached out a hand, still numb from the cold, and pressed it against the smooth clay surface. He jerked it back in surprise. It was warm. Not hot, but distinctly, undeniably warm to the touch. It was radiating a gentle, steady heat. He moved his hand along the wall, feeling the same consistent warmth everywhere. He looked at Alara, his face a mixture of confusion and awe. "The walls," he whispered, "they're warm. They hold the heat from the day," she explained simply. "They give it back to us now." His builder's mind finally grasped the concept. The walls were the stove. The entire structure was a single, massive, slow-release heating element. The small fire wasn't fighting the cold. It was simply charging the battery. The sheer mass of the earth around them was doing the real work, storing and radiating energy, creating a thermal equilibrium that the outside storm could not touch. Then, his practical mind turned to the most critical metric of survival. He looked past the stove to the corner of the room. He saw the wood box. It was small, and it was nearly full. He turned to Samuel. "How much wood have you burned?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Samuel shrugged. "Not so much. A few logs this morning to bake the bread. A few last night. We keep the fire low." Cole did the mental calculation. The Vances had used, in 3 days of the worst storm in living memory, perhaps a tenth of the wood he had burned through. The number was so staggering, so utterly outside the realm of his experience, that it felt like a physical blow. He looked from the full wood box to the barefoot children playing on the floor, to the warm, solid walls around him. The numbers were undeniable. He spotted a small thermometer hanging on a post near the center of the room. He walked over to it. The mercury stood at a steady 67 degrees Fahrenheit. 67 degrees? His own cabin, with a fire that threatened to consume the house, was struggling to stay above 40. This wasn't just survival. This was comfort. This was civilization. He turned back to Alara, the full weight of his error, his arrogance crashing down upon him. He had not just been wrong. He had been dangerously, profoundly wrong. His expertise, the bedrock of his identity, had been a form of blindness. He had looked at this structure and seen only what he expected to see: mud, damp, and cold. He had failed to see the elegant, powerful system at work. He met her eyes, and the words came, stripped of all pride. "I was wrong," he said. The admission hung in the warm, quiet air. "I was completely wrong. This is the warmest house in the territory." He took a deep breath. "Ma'am, will you teach me how to build this way?" The great storm lasted 2 more days. When it finally broke, the landscape was transformed, buried under a sea of white. The cold lingered, but the wind died down, and a fragile sun emerged. One by one, the settlers dug themselves out. The story of what Thomas Cole had found inside Vance's mud pie spread through the shaken community like a wildfire. There was no more mockery. There was only awe. That afternoon, a procession of families made their way to the Vances' earthen home. They came with questions, but they also came with something else. They brought their children. The Vance home became a refuge, the only truly warm and safe place for miles. At night, 9 families, nearly 30 people in total, sheltered within those thick clay walls, sleeping soundly in the gentle, radiant heat. Ilara's home had not just saved her family, it had saved the heart of the community. When spring finally arrived, the lessons of the Great Storm were not forgotten. The first person to begin a new construction was Thomas Cole. He did not fell a single log. Instead, he chose a site on a south-facing slope and began to dig. He worked alongside Ilara and Samuel, learning the art of mixing cob, of shaping the walls, of using the earth not as an enemy to be conquered, but as an ally to be embraced. His conversion gave the method an immediate, powerful credibility. The man who had been its most articulate critic was now its most passionate advocate. Others followed his lead. That summer, 3 more earthen homes were built in the settlement, each one incorporating small improvements and adaptations. They learned to add more sand for strength, to use field stones for the foundation, to design overhangs that would block the high summer sun, but allow the low winter sun to enter. The Vance House, as it was now known, became the new standard. The foolish mud pie had become the blueprint for survival. Ilara never sought credit or fame. She shared her knowledge freely, answering every question with patience and simple, practical advice. Her reward was not praise. It was seeing the children of the settlement playing through the next winter without the constant, hacking coughs of the cold. It was seeing her neighbors' woodpiles last the entire season with fuel to spare. The real impact of her innovation was not measured in degrees on a thermometer or in cords of wood saved. It was measured in the quiet moments of life that the brutal cold had previously stolen. It was a mother being able to put her baby down on the floor to crawl. It was a family being able to sit down for a meal without wearing 3 layers of wool. It was the simple, profound human dignity of being warm and secure in one's own home, no matter how hard the wind howled outside. Ilara Vance's story is a powerful reminder that true innovation often comes from the margins, from those with a different perspective. The settlers were trapped by their own traditions, unable to see the solution that lay literally beneath their feet. They saw the earth as something to be overcome, to be built upon. Ilara saw it as a source of strength, a vast, stable reservoir of energy to be tapped. Her wisdom was not a new invention. It was ancient, carried from the sun-baked mesas of the south to the frozen northern plains. It demonstrated that sometimes the most advanced technology is not a new machine, but a deeper understanding of the natural systems that have always been here. The principles of thermal mass, passive solar design, and earth sheltering that she used are now foundational concepts in modern sustainable architecture. Engineers and architects today use sophisticated computer models to calculate the precise thermal properties of materials, but their goal is the same as Ilara's was, to create comfortable, efficient shelters that work with the environment, not against it. Her simple, hand-built home was a forerunner to the passive houses and green buildings of the 21st century. If this story of frontier ingenuity and the triumph of an idea changed how you think about the world around you, hit that like button. Subscribe for more forgotten wisdom from the pages of history, and let us know in the comments. What is the coldest winter you have ever had to face? We read everyone. The story you have just heard is a fictionalized account inspired by the real historical principles of sod houses, cob construction, and earth-sheltered homes used by pioneers and ancient cultures around the world. While the characters and specific events are products of imagination, the engineering concepts of thermal mass and passive solar design are very real. This content is for educational and entertainment purposes and does not constitute professional engineering or construction advice.